volts over a long period, like 5 or 6 a day, much more than anyone else was doing at the time. And he said that would shock them. It would scramble the brain so much that they would forget everything. They'd lose their identity. They'd forget everything. And then you could rebuild it. So he had tapes made that they'd listen to under their pillow. You know, I'm a nice person. I love people. I love life. Type, stuff. Of course, none of that worked. All that happened was people became traumatized and living in a state of constant shock and fear. And Naomi goes to interview some of the people who'd actually been worked on by this psychiatrist. It is shocking to see that that was permitted back in the 50s. But then the CIA was monitoring it and saw how effective these policies were, and they stole the data and applied it to torture techniques. So they started using extreme electric shock, sleep deprivation, sensory disorientation tactics to break down a personality, and then they would be like putty in your hands. And these techniques, which she exposes really in detail, were then applied by Pinochet, and then by Argentina, and then by Brazil, and Uruguay, and other, as Latin American countries were taken over one by the Milton Friedman ideology, which is the state should be deregulated and dismantled, and there should be no state ownership of anything. So privatize everything. Even schools shouldn't be run by the state, they should all be privatized. Milton Friedman must have been a lunatic, in my opinion, and he desperately needed some shock therapy of his own. He was a psychiatric nutcase. I don't know what motivated him, but he was a magician who fooled a lot of intellectuals. Even Jeffrey Sachs, who is still around and pontificating about this, that and the other, was fooled by him and helped collude in the application of shock therapy in Bolivia, leading to the absolute disaster for the people. Anyway, I've known people that specialise in Latin America. I've not had time to do that myself. And I've learned more from this book than I have from any other source. And it's shocking to use, a bon mot. And of course, as she goes on in the book, she talks about how this technique used by the CIA was then applied in Iraq. And 9/11 was the great shock treatment on a massive scale to traumatize not just America but the world, and then to enable aggressive capitalism to get away with its military nonsense, which it did by invading Iraq in search of oil profits. I mean, these people are mad, literally. They're not just mad, they're evil and dangerous. And the politicians that front these gangsters, the Bushes, are just frontmen, they're just stooges. The real power behind the throne is doing the shocking. So anyway, read the book. Don't trust me to explain it. Yes, so in the UK, there's also attention paid to the history of the Falklands War, because Galtieri and his cadres created a crazy nationalist, jingoistic, let's get the Falklands back type of thing, which is what right-wing leaders always do. They always target and demonise the other. But that unfortunately gave Thatcher the perfect excuse to apply the shock doctrine to the economics of Britain, because having won the Falklands War and killed a bunch of Argentinians using shock tactics, she then turned her ire on the British working classes and the socialist movement and the trade unions, and dare I say it, the hippies at Stonehenge, which is why I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Stonehenge events of 1984, which was all done by Thatcher on the crest of this wave of attacking the enemy within. And she was a close friend of Pinochet and admired Milton Friedman, and was trying to do to the British economy what Milton Friedman had advised and had done to the economies of Latin America. And she knew that it would take a shock to enable that to happen, and that shock was the Falklands War. So fast forward, yes, 9/11. obviously, I'm not sure that, I don't know to what extent, Naomi Klein goes into 9/11. I've written a whole book about it, so I'm still halfway through the book, but it's definitely worth reading. I'll save my final comments till I've finished it. But then I want to mention another book that I've been reading this week, which is really important. I've been reading this for 2 or 3 weeks. And it's about another shock that was done to India. It's called The Betrayal of India, Revisiting the 26/11 Evidence by Elias Davidson. The cover shows an attack on a hotel in Mumbai, one of the luxury hotels in the heart of the city, that were attacked on the 26th of November 2008 in Mumbai, a great city, the gateway to India it's often been called. And it's the financial centre of India. Now, this brilliant book by a 9/11 researcher of Jewish origin who lives in Germany, but is sadly dead, so I can't talk to him. He's done 850 pages of who actually did this. And the first 200 or 300 are exposing the evidence that was presented to prove that it was Pakistan and a particular terrorist group based in Pakistan. Now, what he writes very, very rationally. He bases a lot of work on his combing of the media and sources that were published at the time, and essentially demolishes the court case that was brought against these so-called 9 or 11 terrorists from Pakistan who allegedly landed from a boat, having come all the way from Pakistan. They land on the shore at Mumbai, fan out, and they take over about 5 or 6 key sites. And only 2 gunmen per site are able to then lock down for about 3 days these sites and kill lots of people and cannot be contained. Now, what's so extraordinary, you learn from the book, and to be honest, I came to this book knowing virtually not much about it, and I've learned an awful lot, because the Indians did mobilise commandos. They mobilised naval squadrons of, like, special boat squadron type people. They had armed police go in. Although the figures of how many went in and at what time they went is completely it's not established. But they had enough people to take out these rogue, handful of terrorists, if that's what they were, within a few hours. The fact that they didn't succeed for 3 days, I think, tells us something. And the evidence is that there were many, many plots within plots about this. One of the most shocking and concerning concerns the extreme right wing in India, the RSS, which is behind the BJP, which is a Hindutva nationalist, racist organisation that claims that only India should be Hindu, and everyone of other religions, like Indian Christians who've been there for nearly 2,000 years, they're not really Indians. Jains, Buddhists, Sikhs, none of them count, it's just Hindus. Well, and Muslims, absolutely not. They shouldn't be, they're not counted as proper Indians by this RSS group. And I find this all rather disturbing. Now, it's the fact that a police chief in charge of the anti-terrorist division in the area was investigating a sequence of bomb explosions done by the RSS and was about to bring them to court. He had enough evidence, painstaking policeman. He gathered the evidence that, it would put people away in prison high up in the RSS, and it would impact on their electability. They were not in government at the time, but they were a powerful opposition force, and they had many MPs, and some of them would have been locked away in prison. Now, it so happens that on the very first day, this man was gunned down in the operation, ambushed. He was in a car with a couple of other police officers. He was sent into a part of the city with false instructions. One thing that's interesting is the police logs have never been released. There have been 3 controversial competing police logs revealed, and none of them seem to be accurate. Someone sent him into the line of fire to get killed, and he was killed. We don't know who by. The author, gives some evidence to believe that that was one of the motivations for the entire action. It was to create a smokescreen so they could kill this guy who was on their trail. An interesting synchronicity, which is last week here in the Philosophy Club, I had a visitor, the week before last, from India, who used to be a civil servant in the police force of India, and who actually met this man, Hemant Karkare, and knew him personally because he worked at that time in that region of India, around Mumbai, and said what a good man he was. Hemant Karkare, what a decent, honourable, trustworthy and truthful policeman just trying to do his job. And he discovered the RSS were up to very wicked deeds and was determined to bring them to court. Lo and behold, surprise, surprise, he's killed. So anyway, I recommend this book. Now, so who might have been behind it all? Well, I think we can rule Pakistan out, to be honest, because I think it looks like Pakistan was set up as a patsy. The Pakistani government expressed its horror at the events. It asked India for permission to access the sole survivor, who was claimed by the Indians to be Pakistani. But when the Pakistanis asked to go and interview him, they were denied access. He made a confession, but it was in a sealed, private session, and he later claimed under duress, and when it came into open court, he retracted the confession. He said, no, I did not do all this. I'm not who you say I am. I was an innocent bystander caught up in all this. And the evidence is that Pakistan had nothing actually to do with it, and the whole thing was created by anti-Islamist forces. Certainly those in the senior echelons of the RSS and the BJP would have been involved. Perhaps Modi himself, who was then the leader of that part of India, Gujarat, which is close to Mumbai, and also very possibly anti-Islamic forces from outside, such as Israel. Now, Israel and Mossad were involved in this operation. It's interesting that, for instance, a safe was smuggled out by Mossad a few days after all this took place. One of the places that was shot up was a Chabad house associated with a particular branch of Judaism, which is like an evangelical Jewish tradition. And they had this base in Mumbai, and that was attacked. And the rabbi was killed, and some people escaped. And so the allegation is, it was an anti-Semitic attack. They were trying to take out the Jews. But what's the evidence shows that's probably not the case. And what we know is that the Israeli government, through Mossad, was able to smuggle out a safe containing documents. We don't know what was in them. A couple of days after the incidents all happened. So anyway, it's absolutely really interesting and important reading, and it's very little known, this book. I tracked it down, it was recommended to me by a friend, and I was interested because I've also written a book about 9/11, which is another shock. I don't know that Naomi Klein includes the events of 26/11, 2008 in Mumbai in her shock doctrine, but it seems to me this was a perfect example of these kind of fake terrorist events that happen, which get everybody terrified and usually reaching for the gun to shoot at Muslims, because they're usually the ones that are blamed for these events. I'm not convinced that this is genuine, and I suspend judgment. I think that the events of October the 7th and the massacres that happened are a perfect example of the shock doctrine. The response by Israel has been catastrophic shock, counter shock. When will we stop shocking each other, on this planet? I think that's my question. as a philosopher, I want to ask, when will we start treating each other with respect, kindness, love? We're not that different. I have friends who are Pakistani, friends who are Indian. I've had many British, Indian and Pakistani friends, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Jain. We're all one humanity. And that universal energy of friendship, love and amity should run through us all. Which is why I've been working on my love journal this week as well. I'm editing the 14th issue of the Love Journal, which is the only academic journal in the world on the nature of love. It's crazy, but true. All these shocks are the opposite of love, and I'll report back when I finally finish both books, but that's just a sort of interim report. And I find it, we need to just calm down and learn to live with each other and learn to love each other, in my opinion. In my calendar of saints and sages, which I do every day of the year, today was an interesting bunch, came forward. Today being the 11th of August, and I just want to share a couple of them. I'm not going to do them all, but there were some interesting ones, I think. Today we have Karl Karenyi, who was a Jungian scholar from Hungary. We have Merle Curti, one of the great peace historians of all time, an American historian who inspired my work in peace historiography. We have a Confucian Chinese philosopher, Li Ao, 772 to 836. We have the philosopher Gorgias from Athens in Greece, 485 to 380, who was, during the time of Athenian greatness, he was teaching rhetoric, and he was a sophist rather than a philosopher, but he had strong philosophical components to his work as well. And then we also have Lord Tennyson. And I want to read a bit of a poem by Tennyson. He's a poet that's not that well known anymore, a Victorian poet. And, he deserves to be known, I think, better. This is the conclusion of his great epic In Memoriam poem, which is about the death of his brother. And it reads as follows. O living will that shalt endure, when all that seems shall suffer shock, rise in the spiritual rock, flow through our deeds and make them pure, that we may lift from out of dust a voice as unto him that hears, a cry above the conquered years, to one that with us works, and trust, with faith, that comes of self-control, the truths that never can be proved, until we close with all we loved, and all we flow from, soul in soul. Tennyson's poems repay careful attention, and it's an interesting little known fact that the lady who wrote many books about the nature of God and was a nun and very famous author in religious studies, started her life doing a PhD at Cambridge on Tennyson, which she never finished. I wish she would finish it. He was a deeply spiritual man and, a great visionary. Okay, I'm going to finish there because it's a shorter than usual Philosophy Club. I won't go on because there's so much more to say, and I hope that people find my thoughts useful, and I hope this coming week and the end of the Olympic Games brings reflections to the world that we ought to revive the Delphic Games because they are about culture and the arts and thinking. I do want to mention one last thing. I'm just a slight bee in my bonnet. I've been listening to some talks by Ken Wilber, who's an old, kind of philosopher that I've known about since the early 80s. In many ways, he's the American equivalent to the work I've been doing with my periodic table and so on. We've never met, we've never talked. I've known people that have met him and worked with him and lived next to him in Boulder, Colorado. But I did hear a talk of his which I found a bit disturbing. I just want to say this, and if anyone knows Ken, can you give him a message from me? He's genius, I have no doubt about that. I love his work over the years, and the first book of his I read was The Spectrum of Consciousness in the early 80s, which was a breath of fresh air because he was saying, what I was thinking too. And that's obviously because he was reading all the same books I was reading at the time. We were both steeped in, alternative spirituality, science, consciousness studies, mysticism, Buddhism, Eastern thought. And it came out with Wilberism. Well, this side of the Atlantic, it came out in my work. But what I'm concerned about with where Ken is going, the direction of travel, is he gave this sort of, okay, there's a couple of things that I'm slightly worried about with Ken's work. Is there's a kind of elitism that the grades he takes humanity through, these evolutionary stages, which only a few people have reached the top stages now on the planet, and he, of course, is one of them, and most of them are based in America, as far as I can tell. The Enlightenment stage. There's a kind of disparaging of other cultures, a disparaging of other epistemologies, of other spiritualities, and if I was a Muslim in Nigeria, Hausa speaking, deeply steeped in the Quran and the Hadith, and I believe that I could be just as enlightened as anyone living in Boulder or Colorado, with a whole different set of epistemological assumptions. I would have access to the divine intelligence just the same. If I was an Australian Aborigine working within my culture and my heritage and working with my spirit guides and my sacred places, I believe I could have as much enlightenment as someone working in the libraries of Boulder. But Ken is very disparaging of all these so-called primitive peoples. He sees them as a stage we had to go through and now we've grown out of. He's very disparaging of magic, which he relegates to the simplistic, primitive thinking of these types. I don't see it like that myself. I think that magic is eternal and lives with us, and it's in the poetry of Tennyson, it's in the works of Plato, and it's in my talks. And as a Druid, I'm very interested in, which means magician, by the way, in Gaelic. I'm very interested in the magical traditions of Druidry and how they then metamorphose into the Christian era and now into the modern era. I mean, Yeats is a master magician and a poet and a Druid. James Joyce was a great novelist, a linguist, and a speller of words, and a magician in his own way. So I don't think we should disparage the magical as Wilber does. I think we should honour the Wichon Indians with their sacred psychedelic ceremonies that honour the Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and work with nature spirits and so on. To say, this is all lesser stuff, we've got to ground for that, is, I think, a sort of cultural presupposition that we have to grow out of, Ken. Now, moving on, I see that he's fallen into a rabbit hole of almost, very, very worrying, because he's now spouting a kind of anti-woke ideology. This term, in the hands of right-wing Trumpists, being anti-woke is a sort of badge of honour among people, the kind of people who are rioting in England they're against multiculturalism, they're against racial minorities having any kind of say in the running of the country, they're against most things that decent people take for granted. And to see Ken Wilber joining the anti-woke conspiracy theory mob worried me a great deal. And I think he needs to do some homework. He talks about the importance of thinking about thinking. Right, Ken, do some thinking about thinking. Because the woke tradition, it's an African-American term that meant I've seen through the structures of, power oppression of my people. It's a term that Martin Luther King would have used. It's a term that black intellectual activists have used in America. It's a term that people like Kamala Harris, grew up with. We have to wake up to the problems of humanity. And yet in the right-wing Trump white racist mob, it's become, with their inverted ethics, where good becomes evil and evil becomes good, and the Confederacy are rewritten as the heroes, and slavery is rewritten as, a great thing for the planet, and so on and so on. This complete inversion of truth. So wokeism is an ideology you have to fight and combat. Come on, Ken, please study this thing. Look at it. Talk to Kamala Harris. Give me a phone call. Send me an email and we'll have a chat about this. I'm happy to record it. We can make it public. Because this is a discussion that's needed. I think you're too important to the work of intellectuals of peace to be allowed to fall down that particular rabbit hole. And I've got my Wisdom Keepers Council meeting coming up with Satyen Raja on the 16th of August. A group of us are trying to come together to say, what is wisdom? How can we stand for it? How would that be applied in education, in healthcare, in ecology, in urban planning, in technology and engineering and so on? It's a great group. I'm honoured to be part of it. And you can check out our website, Wisdom Keepers. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So it's a busy time, and yet remember, as Meister Eckhart said, when somebody asked him how did he do all this stuff, what was his secret of being so busy, he said, I'm doing nothing at all because God is doing all the work. And I love that saying. And today is also the day of St. Clare, by the way, the wisdom consort of St. Francis of Assisi. They were just platonic, adorers of each other. And as Francis did his amazing work launching the Franciscans, inspiring great thinkers like Roger Bacon and Raymond Lull and others who've been my heroes. I nearly became a Franciscan when I was like 24. Clare was doing the same with the women Franciscans orders, and they're still going to this day. She was based in Assisi, which I visited. And she was another of those people who knew, like Meister Eckhart, that the saint or sage, really, we have to do nothing and let God do the work. So let's enable that to happen. And the same to all of you. Thank you.